Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this press conference from day number 3 from the 50th anniversary of the annual meeting in Davos here today. Thank you for being here in the room. Thank you for joining on our live stream, and definitely thank you for our panelists here today. The short version is we're here because of two reasons: climate change and Jonathan, but let me elaborate a little bit more. If you've been following the conference for the last 3 days, it is fair to say, I believe, that climate change and the impact of climate change has been one of the absolute headline topics here at the 50th anniversary. It's been discussed from very different angles, private sector angles. Of course, we heard from President Trump, we heard from Greta earlier this week, who have, as you all know, different takes on the subject matter. We want to go a little bit deeper here with this press conference, which is dedicated to climate risk and response, the physical hazards and socioeconomic impacts. So without further ado, let me introduce the wonderful panelists we have to discuss that topic. Today, to my immediate left, I'm joined by Jonathan Wurtzel, who's the director of the McKinsey Global Institute. To his left, we're joined by Dickon Pinner, who's the global leader of the sustainability practice at McKinsey & Company. Very pleased to introduce to you Veronica Scotti, the chairperson for Public Sector Solutions of Swiss Re. And last, but absolutely definitely not least, we're joined by Carl Hess, who's the head of investment risk and reinsurance at Willis Towers Watson. That always almost reads like a haiku, Carl. So nicely done. Jonathan, the reason why I'm saying you're one of the reasons why we're here is because you just published a report on climate risk and response. Let's hear it. What are the key findings of the report? What is it that you want to share with the audience, please?
Okay, thank you so much, Jörg, and thank you, Jeff, and it's a pleasure. So it's a report on physical risk and the socioeconomic impact. So to be very clear, this is about physical risk. It's not about transition risk, and it is about the full inherent risk, what is coming at us in a high emissions, unmitigated scenario. So that's what it is. McKinsey, I should note, is not a climate science institute. We have many scientists who work for the firm, but we did not do the climate science modeling here. We took the modeling and we translated that into socioeconomic impact. And that's what this report is about. So what did we find? Essentially 7 things, more than the usual McKinsey 3. The first is that physical climate risk is increasing. We looked at 9 cases of climate change extremes today. We also did a global geospatial analysis. And what we found in all of our cases was that the climate risk would be increased by between 2 and 20 times over the next 30 years. We were looking at a time frame out to 2050. Secondly, we found that this risk is non-stationary, which is a complicated way of saying it changes all the time. A lot of this is driven by inertia. That carbon accumulation has driven global warming, and so much of this effect is locked in, and that challenges duration. Things that we have taken for granted as having long-term horizons will no longer be the case, whether that is the standards for our infrastructure or the level of our insurance premiums. The third thing that we have found is that it's non-linear. Because this risk challenges our standards, when it goes past a threshold, it booms. It expands geometrically, if not exponentially. So to give one very simple example, in a again, high emissions, unmitigated scenario case, we see that lethal heat waves, defined as a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees, today there's approximately no people who experience that. By the year 2030, there'll be up to 200 million people in India who have a 5% chance every year of experiencing a lethal heat wave. That, by anybody's measure, is a nonlinear response. Fourth, it is a systemic issue because what we find is that there are direct impacts of physical climate risk, but there are also indirect ones. So to take an example of flooding in Ho Chi Minh City, the direct impacts might be up to, say, $500 million of a flood out in the year 2040. The knock-on effects, the interruptions to work, the impacts on transport could be up to $1.5 billion. And so it's a systemic issue. What we're dealing with is not only the direct, but the indirect impacts. Fifth, it's spatial. this risk happens somewhere. It happens to somebody somewhere. And as a result, the impacts are different. Sometimes they can even be positive. If we look at agriculture, higher temperatures will lead to higher yields in some northern latitudes. On the other hand, of course, in areas which have historically been already exposed to the risk, more extreme risk will lead to more negative impacts. Sixth, it is regressive. It tends to affect the most vulnerable populations more severely. Specifically, countries with a lower per capita GDP are more at risk. Partially that is because of geography, because of their greater exposure to equatorial latitudes. Partially it's because of level of development. They are also the countries that work more outdoors, and as a result, they are more exposed, their GDP is more exposed to natural climate risks. And finally, we would say that we are underprepared. Given the expanding nature of physical climate risk, that the level of adaptation preparation we have today is insufficient. Essentially, pretty much every piece of infrastructure we have will have to be reconsidered, and that will require tough choices about where, who, and how to adapt. So those are the 7 characteristics of physical climate risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. President Trump mentioned the prophets of doom in his speech. I think he meant the climate activists, but there's a little bit of doomy scenario here. So what do decision makers have to do? We have like 3,000 participants here in Davos. What's your recommendation to them?
Thank you, Georg. Well, firstly, I think this novel assessment and quantification of physical climate risk, which we have put in a probabilistic and spatial fashion, tees up, I think, a very clear roadmap. And I think that in having that roadmap, it is not alarmist, it's sort of realistic and probabilistically framed. And it tees up 3 things, and I'll just walk you through them. The first one is we need to put physical climate risk at the heart of all decision-making and risk management. Much like cyber security and risk was probably quite thought of as niche 10 years ago and is very integral to many decisions today, I think we're going to have to do the same with climate risk. So in terms of where you allocate your capital, where you source your supply chains, which products you develop, will all now have to be with the idea that, as Jonathan said, the climate is changing, and that changes the set of assumptions. Just a mindset change, which Jonathan mentioned, rethinking duration. So things that were, say, a 1 in 100 chance of happening, if that is now, say, a 1 in 10 chance, and you have a coastal toll road that you are trying to finance, over a 10-year period, the cumulative effect of that probability means that it has gone from a 10% event, say, of flooding, to a 65%, so more likely than not. And that will affect the cost of debt, cost of insurance, so it fundamentally affects project finance. So that's an example of how you have to rethink risk management, and I think you have to use tools now that are forward-looking, using the best climate science versus backward-looking, given that much of what we know is changing. The second major thing is we need to adapt. And I don't hear much of that at this conference. I don't hear much of it in the debate. And I think there's a lack of awareness. And hopefully, by putting a strong lens on this problem, it will reinforce the fact that the next 10 years of warming is really locked in. And so regardless of what we do, there is a certain amount of change, and you have to adapt. And we're underprepared, and there's lots you can do. And I'll just mention a couple. Physically, seawalls, planting mangroves in terms of natural protection, HVAC and cooling systems, designing things to new tolerances. I'll give you one example, a runway for an airport. If those places get hotter, the air gets thinner, you actually need more length of runway for the plane to get lift. So designing for criteria that are 10 or 20 years out, you may actually make that runway longer and do that now. Financially, we need to adapt. Jonathan mentioned insurance, and I know we'll talk more about that. But there is a duration mismatch, for example, on insurance of mortgages and the length that the policy is held by the owner, which is 30 years. We looked at Florida, and we found, due to just one impact parameter, which is flooding, frequency of flooding, that you could see, because financial markets pull forward impacts, you could see a $30 to $80 billion hit on valuations by 2050, and I don't think financial markets are ready for that. And moreover, places like Florida are very dependent on property taxes because they don't have an income state tax. And then last thing on adaptation is we need to behaviorally adapt. There are a lot of mindset shifts, efficiency versus resiliency. We're used to sort of stripping out things. Maybe we need more redundancy and to prepare for the unknown. Should you own assets or rent them? Should assets be fixed or mobile? These are all things that sort of fundamentally change. And then lastly, the third thing that we have to do is decarbonize. And this report is not a decarbonization report, but it is a report about risk. And the only way to take long-term risk beyond 10 years out of the system is to stop putting carbon into the system. And so the way we look at it is all three of these things. It's not an option. We're underprepared. And I think, the good news in a way is that we know the bad news, but we know it with enough time. There is time to react, but it is urgent.
The good news is we know the bad news. I'm not sure if you ended on an optimistic note there, but that has become very clear. Veronica, your colleagues already spoke a lot about insurance. Now, obviously, you've been looking at these issues for a while already.
35 years.
Yeah. So, what does this mean for your industry? What is the impact, and how do you have to rethink basically how you approach these challenges?
So as an organization, we actually started to move already a few years back. I will offer very few statistics, I promise you. They've done a great job, and it's wonderful to actually see this level of mobilization and quality in the report that you put together. So the one number I want to share with you is that if we take 25-year horizon and we look at the average losses for extreme weather events, which is what we cover as a company and as an industry, they've doubled. And this is related to urbanization, it's related to concentration of assets, but it's also related to climate change. It's very, very clear to us. And because we are I guess, a commercial organization, we don't need to necessarily get everyone's agreement. We do what we believe will give us another 150 years of prosperous business. And so the vision that we have for our own business is one where we need to make sure that the premium that we collect from our policyholders, and that there is a promise attached to the premiums, there is a very clear promise to pay once the claims happen, is very, very soundly invested. And that's why we decided already a few years back to actually move away from those exposures that we believe will very soon translate in stranded assets. That's why Swiss Re participated and joined and speaks about the Asset Owner Alliance, which is a very bold move. And I'm very pleased that even here in Davos, more members have joined from all walks. It's not just the insurance industry. So it's extremely important that we invest in a responsible way, and that we could do that step from an asset perspective. But what we've also been doing, and by the way, another statistic, because it doesn't take 10 years. By making that move from 2016 to today, we've actually reduced our carbon footprint of our investments by 52%. So if all companies took those steps, we could actually together do a lot. I think it's beautiful to see champions of the industry, of the asset management industry also moving, but ideally the all financial sector recognizes that this is very, very serious, and we all have fiduciary duties one way or the other. On the other hand, we also have a risk capital position. And as a reinsurance company, the largest in the world, that's exactly what we do. We go where we can assess the risks. And our view is very clear. We need to put our capital at risk, especially in those industries that are going to give us low carbon impact. So for us, it's very important to invest in those technologies, which today are not mainstream, but over the next 10 years are going to make a huge difference to the resilience or vulnerability of our societies if they're not put in place. And one very final point on adaptation. Actually, I think adaptation has been on the at least for us in the industry, has been on the map. We published the economics of adaptation 10 years ago. We developed the methodologies publicly available. There are other ways of doing it. But, you know the statistics very well. For every dollar of adaptation, you actually get $5 downstream. So it's very doable. What needs to happen is adaptation at scale. And it needs to happen for three reasons. First of all, because there is societal impact. And so one of the steps that we've taken with the Insurance Development Forum, of which we are a founding member, we decided to put aside billions of capacity to help the most vulnerable countries in the world, the V20. That's extremely important because they don't really have a plan B, so we have to find ways to help them adapt. And that money needs to go to the poorest because it is regressive. So we need to create a bridging mechanism, otherwise it's going to become very difficult socially. The second thing is investing in nature-based solutions. And that's another thing that I think today is very much undervalued. But with innovation, with insurance, because we recognize there is value, and related to that loss of value, there is a risk component. When you link the two together, actually, we can do pretty creative things. I'm sure you're familiar with the coral reef solution that we put in place with Natural Conservancy. That could be replicated across many of the other nature-based solutions that are being considered by the high-level panel. So there's a lot that the industry could do, and I hope I can create more optimism, because it doesn't take 10 years. I think 5 years from now, we will see a tectonic shift already, if we maintain the momentum.
Thank you, Veronica. Carl, let's go a little bit deeper on that point of investment that Veronica and the other speakers already mentioned. So how do we, and I think, Dickon, you mentioned 30 to 80 billion US dollars of a potential gap there.
Yeah, potential valuation impact as a result of nuisance flooding.
How do we get people to invest more in the necessary preparation to reach that adaptation, to make more resilience possible?
Thanks, Georg. And I guess I'd break that into 2 bits, right? Invest more, yes, but invest correctly. Otherwise, won't be investing well. I think I could think of 3 components that are critical for this process to go forward in a positive way. And I think we'd say to get the finances right, you've got to get the physics right. And so building proper analytical models available to all players in the ecosystem, be they governors, governments, infrastructure owners, investors, is critical for us to begin a common parlance to be able to price this in correctly. It's also going to take a supportive regulatory regime to enable capital flows to match, as Veronica said, bridging mechanisms, right, to help capital find and manage risk, and to enable pooling, so that individual enterprises, which may not have the ability to fund climate change effects by themselves, can bring it together and actually self-insure on a collaborative basis. Thirdly, I think effective risk transfer vehicles are a must. And Veronica cited the example of the protection for coral. These sort of vehicles and parametric insurance in general, where we can set up model-based and quickly transferable vehicles that enable countries and companies and individuals to manage their risk effectively and cheaply are critical for us to be able to manage the long-term effects as well as the transition. From an investment perspective, truly integrated ESG is a must. And that has got really 2 dimensions to it. Risk, which we've looked at for years, but the return potential. The amount that's going to be spent here is tremendous. With that will come tremendous opportunity, not just tremendous risk. It's going to take long-term thinking on behalf of both asset owners and the companies they invest in, and that will take change. But at the end, to the extent we can find good product design in the investment market, that will help address the gaps we have societally for income and for liquidity, I think there's actually tremendous potential here.
Thank you very much. I want to ask 2 follow-up questions, and they both relate to timing. Number 1 is, are the people aware of what's going to hit them? The 7 things that you mentioned, Jonathan, that sounds a little bit like the 7 apocalyptic horsemen of climate risk and physical hazards. If you talk to your peers here at the conference, but also outside this place, do people know how bad it could be if they don't act? Is the sense of urgency there, I guess is my question.
Well, I think first of all, we think that the science has really taken a huge step in the last 5 years. And so it's not unreasonable that this is new, in the sense that the ability to take what has been a global forecast and translate that into local effects and the implications, that's new. And with that, we have now, I think, a better sense for the level of risk. So to answer your question, I think yes, the answer is perhaps not as much as they need to be. That the mindset shift that Dickon refers to, which is behavioral as much as it is financial and physical, has to be recognized. I mean, simply put, that non-stationary, non-linear, systemic effects are things that are very hard to get your head around until they happen to you. And so I think that is where we hope this makes a contribution, because at the end of the day, it will be up to each and every decision maker, be they social or governmental or corporate, to assess that risk for themselves. I stress that we have taken a view of the full risk, and then it is up to us to decide what we will do about that, and what our actions will be.
Thank you. And I guess my second question on timing is, we're having two different conversations here, right? So we say, Dickon, you said the first 10 years are locked in, but the protesters outside the fence of the annual meeting, they're saying, we want change now. And Greta said it here last year and this year again, the world is on fire. So how do we match kind of the long-term investment that needs to happen, that we need to adapt, that we need to create the resilience with basically the public perception that the things happen, yes, but they happen too slowly? What's your perspective on that? Anyone? Yes.
So I actually, because I covered the public sector, I have to say there is a lot of interest, much more than, say, 3 or 4 years ago. At the time, it was an intellectual exercise. By the way, we've transacted over 200 transactions, and it's not about the value, a dollar value of these transactions, although, they come up to a big number overall. But what really the value intrinsic in these transactions is that we put governments at all levels on a path towards disaster risk management that isn't just emergency, but is preparedness. So to be able to execute any of these transactions, they've had to identify a person to evaluate what we propose. Someone that understands the models and the calculations, someone that understands the impact and how the distribution needs to happen. So I find this is, any transaction we put in place, for me, is a victory on the side of sustainability, because we've actually created the conditions possible for many more actions that are much bigger in scale to take place. And so I actually found throughout the 30 meetings I've had in 3 days only, that there is a great desire to move into action. Of course, the government apparatus needs, any government, any size, needs to actually be ready to execute on this front.
How ready are the governments? Because desire is not enough.
I think they're getting ever more ready. So I work a lot with development banks as well, at all levels, multilateral, national, regional. And what is happening, and I think in the panel that you hosted, Kristalina Georgieva now, as representative of the IMF, has put it also on the IMF agenda. So what we're creating today is a group of stakeholders that have the funds, the ability, the intelligence to actually help countries around the world that want to get quickly on this path to take actions. And there are very clear roadmaps on how to get it done. It will take 10 years. Mexico, we started working with Mexico 14 years ago, is one of the most advanced countries because they put it even in their constitution, that certain money needs to go into preparedness and disaster management. But others are very curious. So I'm actually convinced that we'll move from the 200 to the 600 in the next 2 or 3 years, because it has to happen exactly because there is unrest. So it's not just enough, in my view, to say we have a problem, but we need to show this is what a good solution looks like, make that solution available, fundable, sustainable, and then create the knowledge, exactly what Carl mentioned, the tools, the methodologies, make it publicly available so that decisions can be taken. I think there's some still today, and I'll finish up, I promise. Maybe today somewhere in the world there are still people who think that they are immune, but I will cite what the Prime Minister of St. Lucia told us just a couple of months ago. And he said, St. Lucia is a case for the world. My population will not have employment, will not have housing, will not have a future. So look at us, because as you can fix it in the small island state of St. Lucia, which has limitation of its own because it's such a concentrated economy, you can fix it everywhere else. And I think there is some genuine truth in there. We need to help each other out because those learnings will be portable to many other countries.
Thank you, Veronica. Carl, you want to?
It's just to add on that a little bit. I mean, well, the shouting at the gates really has, I think, spurred the community here on Davos to actually try to accelerate the progress that's already been made. And I can't think of a conversation I've had with an asset owner or an asset manager this week that hasn't focused on what is this going to mean to us and the people we have to answer to. And so the universality of that will drive investment decisions. The fact that governments are forcing disclosures will drive behavior changes in the corporate market. And we're not talking about 5 years from now, we're talking about this year.
I mean, what I maybe just building on that, I mean, ultimately, we look at this as a capital allocation problem. Right now, you have capital that are going into risky assets, in some cases that are further promoting risky behavior. And you need a series of price signals to both protect what you've got and decarbonize. So I think where we came at it, you got the physical risk. We started with physical because it's the root cause of all risk. But then what follows from that is the transition risk. And I think the balance here is if you wait too long, you bump into the physical risk, some of which is going to happen in any case, which will have a regulatory response based on regressive impacts. If you move way too fast and you transition the economy in a way that, that also has regressive impacts on lower GDP, which will also be regressive. So finding that line, but, so it's not being alarmist, it's trying to put that sense of what's out there, but it is a balance. And the key, I think, is, adaptation, decarbonization in parallel, bringing this is why we've worked with Swiss Re and Willis Towers Watson, is, it's the risk framing, I think, that makes this so powerful.
I'll add one word. I mean, I think what this demonstrates to us is that climate risk is a feature, not a bug, of our current development model, and as such, it needs to be addressed structurally, and that it will affect pretty much every aspect of the capital allocation mechanism. And in so doing, as they say, change happens little by little and then all at once. And I believe at this event we have started to see the all at once.
Thank you. Mindful of our time, let's see if we have any questions from the floor. Ryan, you look like you want to ask a question, but you don't dare to. We have a microphone, please. No, please. There's a microphone.
Let's do this. I'm actually literally looking at a draft article now by some of my colleagues, and the headline is, "We're so woke, Davos convinces itself, but nobody else." So I guess the follow-up question I'd have for that maybe can feed into this article, is that we have seen the WEF make a very big push on these issues. You've said that clearly this comes up in conversations with the people who do make financial decisions. I'm interested to know how the timeline for taking action. Is it really within 2020 where you can start to see a lot of these risks being factored into? Sorry, I'm not coming up with the right words because I missed the framing of the conversation. I want to check in on your skepticism levels or your acceptance levels that people are going to be taking immediate actions in the course of 2020 to take a better account of climate risk, whether it's with their current assets, whether it's with their future investments, or do you think that the shouting at the gates will have to continue for another year or two before all of your work, all of that shouting sort of translates into sort of meaningful action as opposed to meaningful commitments?
Well, maybe from talking to a lot of the asset managers, insurance companies, banks, and there is a regional flavor to this, but the dialogue has certainly changed. The action of banks in Europe has already changed because there's a bit of a regulatory framework out there. I think you need to see capital move, but I think that again this risk lens, if you can show that there is risk in a 10-year framing, which we very clearly do, actually investors have a fiduciary duty to do something about it. And so our sense is that capital will start to move, and that is our hope, because if it doesn't start to move reasonably quickly now, there will be a disorderly movement of capital later on. So this is all about the orderly transition by putting that lens on the problem.
I would say there are two communities at stake here that are very influential. One is the financial community, which you just addressed, and the other is the public sector and the representation. So I think in this context that we have already seen the public sector initiate a response to the adaptation. There, as we highlight, Ahmedabad has a heat planning plan, India has a national cooling plan, and China has a national climate adaptation plan. I think just the last week we saw billions of dollars going through the U.S. Congress to be allocated for increased extreme weather. I think they struggled really hard to avoid including the word climate. That is, I think, already happening as far as the more consistent global. We are encouraged, frankly, by the level of conversation that we've had. It's never been better, and we think there'll be more. I think Kristalina did a very good job laying out a lot of the multilateral initiatives that could be taken here to address both the physical and the transition risk. So, yeah, watch the space.
If I may just add, Ryan, for me, there is just one but in your question, and it's not whether 2020 is the year. I think this is a real paradigm shift. So we are changing the basis of how financial decisions are taken. So I would invite you not to declare victory or failure on the basis of 2020. But what you're hearing from this panel is that there is great seriousness to see already very clear directional and concrete action in 2020. But we cannot keep our guard down. Let's say even if we got 5 or 6 major things going, that doesn't mean we're done. This has to become permanent.
And to be honest, right, institutions of all sorts, there aren't very many first adapters, right? You heard about one. And I give Veronica and Swiss Re credit for being early to the auction. You have a lot of third adapters. And, 2020 may be the year we get to seconds. By the time the next few years around, the pack moves, right? It's suddenly all at once.
So, mindful of the time, I'd like to direct you to mckinsey.com/CGI, where you'll find the report. We can also, if you were just as late as Ryan, you can rewatch the whole press conference again and get the whole framing of the conversation. So it's a fantastic resource. Make good use of it. Share it with your peers. It's now my pleasure to say thank you to all of you here in the room, on the live stream, and most importantly to everybody.